Welcome to the Communist live stream meeting of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. We'll be starting in just a few minutes, so stay on the channel and bear with us.
On your computer audio.
Okay, don't sit there.
Hey guys. So I think we're now live. I'm getting the nod to say that that's the case. Okay, in which case I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting. This is a meeting of the CPGB-ML, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. And we have called this meeting a Zoom meeting, online meeting, to mark the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, or as the Koreans called it, the Fatherland Liberation War. The Korean War was started in 1950, and between 1950 and 1953, the United States of America dropped a greater tonnage of bombs on the Korean peninsula than they had in the entire continent, in the entire course of their involvement in World War II. It's a massive devastation, as well as numerous massacres like the Songun-ri incident being a very typical example. This was a devastating war, a war of genocide in which some 3 million Koreans and 1 million Chinese volunteers lost their life. It was a war that marked the course. It was indicated, that signposted the way to that the United States, come to its new role as global superpower following World War II, would act throughout the remaining period. And in the whole of the intervening period, throughout the whole of this 70 years, we've in fact not seen a single day's peace. There are lists, and I invite you to look them up, which will document just which countries and when have been invaded, had their governments destabilized, overthrown, had democracies subverted, have puppets installed throughout the world, throughout the South American region. Daniel Ortega made a very beautiful speech, and I invite you to have a look on our email feed. You can see my own email feed on Twitter, actually, if you look at Rango, R-A-N-G-O 1917. If you look at the Communists' Twitter feed, at CPGBML. If you look at the deputy leader of our party, Jyoti Bra's Twitter feed, at Jyoti2, number 2, Gaza, then you will see links to many relevant pieces of information. But one of them is a very beautiful speech made by Daniel Ortega just on the 19th of July, which is the 41st anniversary of their revolution, the Sandinista revolution, saying that the greatest threat that the world currently faces is not the pandemic of COVID, but it's the pandemic of COVID in the context of the global threat of a capitalist economic order which has arrogated itself the right in the person of the United States of America in particular, but followed obviously by United Kingdom, followed by the NATO countries, followed by the European Union countries, to a lesser extent, others, partners, junior partners of US imperialism, and arrogated themselves the right to subvert any democracy, where if they do not like the democratically elected government, they can simply say we don't recognize them and nominate another, as they have done in Venezuela, rob them of their resources very brazenly, as they did in Venezuela or Libya, steal their sovereign wealth funds. Korea was the first war following the Second World War in which this pattern was set. And for that reason alone, it's a very important date to mark, but also for the incredible and heroic resistance of the Korean people. We're going to have two speeches. Unfortunately, the speaker from the Democratic Republic of Korea, the DPRK, North Korea, was unable to join us today due to the COVID pandemic. But we've got two party speakers, one from our youth section. Jack is going to speak to you and give you a short précis of the events of the Korean War and why we celebrate it. And then our main speaker for the evening is going to be our excellent comrade and Central Committee member, Christina Kostela, who is also a dancer and an academic, and she'll give her own take with emphasis on culture, as always, on just why we need to celebrate this. We are well aware in our party that solidarity with the people of the north of Korea is not considered a sexy and happening target for sympathy. Far easier, people have found it to sympathize with Cuba. They do so in a slightly backhanded way, but they can culturally understand it. North Korea, a small country with just 23 million population, as opposed to the south of Korea, where it was artificially divided, as we'll hear, which has 50 million population. North Korea, which has been a victim of stereotypical racism and ridicule. There are so many ways in which our trendy left, as well as the right wing, ridicule this nation. But we have absolutely no reason to be arrogant towards the North Koreans. The people of North Korea have made incredible and heroic sacrifices. General Douglas MacArthur, when he bombed North Korea, he said that they were going to bomb North Korea into the Stone Age and it would take Korea 1,000 years to rise. This was the vindictive hatred. And if you've seen some of our advertisements for the meeting, you'll see that 90% of the cities of the North Korea were obliterated by this carpet bombing, by the use of napalm, by their threatening to use nuclear weapons. The United States still threaten to use tactical nuclear weapons. It's their ambition to have the ability to use them in their asymmetric one-sided war in which there can be no retaliation with the peoples of the world to enforce their economic domination. This again was a tactic that was trialed in the north of Korea. In fact, they planned to go further. Once the Chinese Liberation Army had so heroically come to their aid, they planned to, in the words of Douglas MacArthur, string a necklace of plutonium across China, which would inflict a lasting and devastating toll upon their race, in his words, for thousands of years to come. So for all these reasons, and because, of course, the North Koreans were the first to fight heroically the United States with Chinese and Soviet help to a stalemate, to actually show that steadfast struggle with correct leadership can actually win your independence. And in the words of Ho Chi Minh, nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. And so for this reason, other nations do not look upon the North Koreans in the stereotypical way that we're encouraged to when we look at the Sun, when we look at the Daily Mail. We stand steadfastly with this nation. We celebrate its right to independence, and we send our message of greetings and say that we appreciate their heroic efforts to stand up against the brazen threats which are ongoing. Just as at this moment, we know that our Navy has threatened to send its warships, its aircraft carriers, a few remaining aircraft carriers to the South China Sea in an escalating tension against China. We have said for a long time that these annual military exercises conducted by the United States in conjunction with the puppet government of the South of Korea, which is an extremely right-wing, repressive and dictatorial government, have in fact been not only a constant threat and a violation of the civil rights and peace of the people of North Korea, but of course aimed against the Chinese as well. So for all these reasons, it's more topical than ever that we stand in solidarity with the free people of the North of Korea. And with those words, I'm going to hand over to our young comrade from Red Youth, Jack Graham, who's going to tell you a bit more about it. Over to you, Jack.
Hello, comrades and friends, and thank you for joining us today on this special occasion. Today, we remember the brave and honorable sacrifices of the Korean people during the Fatherland Liberation War. We also celebrate the victories and achievements of the Korean people during their long journey to fulfill the dream of a united, independent, and prosperous Korea. After the defeat of Japanese imperialist armies in Korea and the rest of Asia, the Soviet Union and the USA were tasked with disarming and removing Japanese troops from Korea. While the Soviet Union fulfilled their obligations to the Korean people, US imperialism, with hawkish eyes, found yet another opportunity to enrich itself, instead occupying the south of Korea and exploiting its people and its land. US imperialism purposely divided Korea, denying the Korean people their homeland, denying them their right to exist as united as a people. The US, so to speak, ripped a child from the Korean people's arms, that child being a unified, independent Korea, free to pursue its own path to prosperity and happiness. The Korean people waged a brave and heroic struggle, a struggle which even to this day continues in order to reunite their beloved country, to reunite their people. It's important to note that during the Fatherland Liberation War, we saw, as we saw in the Spanish Civil War of the 30s, for example, a great example of proletarian internationalism, of the peoples of the socialist world rallying to the banner of liberation of an oppressed people. The Soviet Union's 64th Fighter Aviation Corps and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, along with support and aid from other socialist countries, played an important role in helping assist the Korean people in their bloody and grueling struggle against the imperialist powers. This time of year represents victory for the socialist forces of the DPRK in defending their homeland and their socialist system from the attempts of imperialism and its puppet in the south of Korea to vanquish them from history by force. The victory over imperialism, however, came at a huge and tragic cost. 4 million Koreans killed, along with total destruction of many towns and the city of Pyongyang. This further adds to the colossal death count of imperialism, which already kills millions around the world on a yearly basis in its attempt to exploit the working class and also the resources of Mother Nature in the crazed and illogical pursuit of ever more and never-ending profits for the bourgeoisie. It further adds to the death count of many millions of brave and honorable workers and peasants who died defending their homelands, their bastions of working class power, from ruin and destruction at the hands of the imperialists. The DPRK pursued a brave and independent path of their own making. With the guidance of the Workers' Party of Korea, they have managed to build a self-reliant nation, a nation that they should be more than proud of. Schools, universities, hospitals and clinics, agriculture and industry, a policy of self-reliance and defense of the people and nation. They have managed to do what so few countries throughout history have achieved. That is providing a meaningful and fulfilling life to its workers. They, to this day, keep the sharp claws of imperialism at bay, protecting the people of the DPRK from ruthless exploitation and misery. They have achieved this even though they have been subjugated to one of the most ruthless campaigns of imperialist propaganda, sanctions, and sabotage. A campaign against the DPRK which is ongoing as we speak at this very moment. The fact that they have held so steadfast and so boldly against the imperialist onslaught is a testament to the bravery and strength and to the determination of the people of the DPRK, and shows their willingness in the global fight of humanity in defeating the wild wolves of imperialism, in defeating the slave shackles of class society, of ending exploitation. We will always remember the many great and heroic sacrifices the Korean people gave to the cause of freedom and socialism, the global march towards communism, towards mankind's liberation. Glory to the light and long life to the Workers' Party of Korea. Victory for humanity in our world historic battle for socialism and peace. Thank you, comrades.
Jack, thanks so much for that message. It's a poignant reminder that the reason this tiny nation, and it's worth just remembering, 23 million people stood up to a coalition in which the United States, not only with its own population, which was then in the region of 300 million, but led a coalition under the banner of the United Nations. At that time, they had excluded China from their rightful seat on the United Nations. Their Taiwanese puppet, again, very relevant, when the United States interceded to stop that civil war from coming to its fruition, and basically gave itself another entire seat on the United Nations by giving its own puppet in Taiwan that seat. So depriving 1 billion, well, at that time, 700 million, now 1.4 billion would be, people of a voice to speak in the United Nations. China, of course, had been one of the major allies in the war, generally written out of the history of the war. And the Korean people had also been one of the major allies in the war. The Koreans have been fighting Japanese imperialism relentlessly, continuously, since 1905, since they were colonized by the Japanese after the Russo-Japanese War, which itself in 1905 played such a part in the fermenting of the social revolution within Russia and causing a revolution in Russia, which ultimately led, perhaps in part, to the Soviet Union's revolution in the USSR. From that period, the Japanese, when they beat the Beys of Tatar Russia, occupied Korea, and they ruled there ruthlessly, barbarically, brutally. It's still remembered today. They took perhaps as many as 500,000 to 1 million comfort women into service in Japan. The Korean people fought and fought heroically, and it's for this reason, under the leadership of the ancestors, in fact, the grandfather of Kim Il-sung, the Korean people had striven for national liberation. They'd fought against the early attempts of the United States to colonize. They'd been key leaders in the anti-Japanese struggle. And of course, they ultimately went on to win the liberation from the United States. How did the United States come to be in occupation? As Japan was defeated in the Second World War, with China and Korea having played such a huge role in that defeat, not widely recognized. The Red Army, who liberated from the north, met the United States, who had taken over power from the Japanese. There was quite an orderly handover of power in the south directly to the United States. Both had a mandate to hand over their power and reunify Korea. The Soviet Union allowed free and fair elections to go ahead. And unsurprisingly, those forces, that party, the Workers' Party of Korea, who had been instrumental in the liberation, in the resistance movement, just as the French had a resistance against the Nazis in the Second World War that we know so much about, well, we should know about. So the Koreans, the Workers' Party of Korea, were absolutely key in uniting the resistance movement behind enemy lines and ultimately forming a regular army and the national government. Of course, they won elections overwhelmingly, and then the Soviet Union withdrew and allowed the Koreans to rule themselves. That was meant to be their democratic mandate. In the South, we know that the United States refused to do that. John Foster Dulles, this notorious early, if you like, a strategic thinker behind US imperialism, together with his brother, and Harry Truman, were determined that they wouldn't allow a united Korea to merge, as it would be a significant player. Rather, they wanted to use all their military bases that they'd gained during the Second World War to build up a network of bases worldwide and have their hegemony. So they occupied Japan. And in fact, the nuclear bomb that they dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was much more about reneging. It was a threat to the Soviet Union. It was precisely aimed to stop the Soviet Union from jointly occupying Japan, as had been the initial plan under the Yalta agreements. So it was to stop the Japan coming under joint occupation of the Allies, but rather exclusive United States occupation, and it still occupies, still has bases in Japan. It still has bases in South Korea, and it built up the fascist dictator No Gun-ri. It built up the fascist dictator No Gun-ri precisely to become its pawn in a very similar way, analogous way to people know the recent history of Venezuela. That if they don't like the president, Nicolas Maduro, they simply say, this is not the president and we'll appoint our own. Here's a John Guaido, who we want to be the president. Well, they did it slightly more successfully because they had actual military occupation, but they trained a fascist army, frustrated and disarmed and committed many atrocities against the true resistance and against the progressive forces in the South. And there are many documented instances of that I won't go into now, but I invite our listeners, our watchers, to look into it themselves and educate themselves. And there are plenty of material, both on the Lalkar website and on the communists' website, where if you simply search Korea, you'll find so much historical detail to back up what we're saying. So John Foster Dulles paid visits just before the Korean War, laid the path to the Korean War, and incited the South to attack the North. So it was very much the case that this was a war that was planned and inspired and launched by the South Korean puppets of United States America against the North Koreans. It was precisely and explicitly a war against communism, but it was precisely and explicitly a war against the rising national liberation movements, which set the scene and the political flavor of the post-war years. Just as Britain fought in Malaya to try and stop now the Malaysian people from gaining their independence under communist leadership, as America would later drown the Indonesian people in blood to stop the progressive liberation movement rising, kill 1 million people there. So this brutal war that they fought against the people of Korea was aimed not only at the Korean people, but it was aimed against all progressive humanity. And it's so important that we never forget that. United States, I'm sometimes shocked by the temerity that they have to talk about dictatorship, to talk about brutality, to talk about an army of the North Koreans, when the North Koreans have had to defend their liberty against direct onslaught of the United States imperialists in such recent living memory, really. Just 70 years ago, 67 years ago, the war ended. There are people still alive who fought in that war. When you post on the internet, you'll find Americans who say that they know people who fought in that war. This is a war where people are still alive who fought this war. This was a tremendously unjust war aimed at the working and progressive people of Korea, but also the working and progressive people of the entire world, and aimed to stop the rise and spread of national liberation movements across the globe. So it's an extremely timely reminder that our mission is far wider than a single country. And it's an example, when we look at Korea, that this is when the progressive socialist movements of the key countries were still fighting together. And when they united together, when they used proletarian internationalism in word and in deed, that they were able to vanquish the most mighty enemy. So thank you for that fantastic contribution, Jack. And without saying any more, I'm going to hand over to Christina, who's going to be our main speaker for the evening. Christina, thank you so much.
Good evening, comrades. I'm here in this important commemoration of the Korean War, and I'm here to share a few insights from studying the history of the Korean War. And as Ranjit explained, this is a very important task for any anti-imperialist, not least for a person like me, who is Greek and who had my native country participating in this war. And it is very interesting, as Ranjit explained, to see the chain of the savage suppression of anti-imperialist movements that are linked to what is happening that we're going to study tonight about Korea, how we see protagonists of the Greek Civil War in Greece, like General MacArthur, who was, of course, with the side of the monarchy and the fascists, fighting Greek communist partisans, liberators from the Nazis. And then we see the same protagonist, of course, in Korea, in the Korean War. So I'm here to share a few insights from the history that is not a sterile academic pursuit, but it is there resonating with messages that can educate us, can equip us to face the challenges that lie ahead for us. So it was Tuesday, the 27th of June, 1950, when President of the US, Truman, announced in the following words the military intervention of the United States in the Korean War, spreading terror throughout humanity. I have ordered the United States Air Force and Navy to provide cover and support to Korean government troops. The attack on Korea makes it clear beyond any doubt that communism has gone beyond the use of subversive methods to conquer independent nations and has now begun to use armed invasion and war. The day before President Truman's speech, the president of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Kim Il-sung, addressed his compatriots in these words. Dear brothers and sisters, fighters of our People's Army and partisans of the southern part of our republic, on June 25th, the government army, a puppet of the traitor Ri Sing-man, launched an attack against the territory north of the 38th parallel. After examining the situation, the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea ordered our People's Army to launch a decisive counterattack and crush the enemy's armed forces. These are the two voices of the two sides of the Korean War. One is that of the perpetrator and the other of the heroic defender. Today, we take sides. We don't engage in a postmodern pursuit of fence sitting that equates the perpetrator and the victim. Today, we commemorate the heroic war of the Korean people for the liberation of their fatherland from imperialism. We'd like to say a few words about Korea before the war. Korea had been a Japanese colony since the late 19th century. The victory of the Great October Revolution had a tremendous effect on the resistance of the Korean people against the Japanese, whilst socialist ideas became a material force of the revolutionary movement. Thus, in 1925, the Communist Party of Korea was founded, and the working class, which had grown up with the development of capitalism, of course, under the influence of Japanese capitalism, acquired a driving force for its own political revolutionary struggle, which became indeed massive and opened the road to a nationwide anti-colonial struggle. In 1932, an armed guerrilla movement began to develop against the colonialists, and it quickly acquired the character of a People's Revolutionary Army, while in 1936, a broad national anti-Japanese front was formed. Throughout World War II, the Korean people developed their own revolutionary movement for the liberation of their country. Until August 1945, when Korea was liberated by the Red Army, Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. It was then divided into two zones of military responsibility. To the north and up to the 38th parallel stretched the Soviet military zone, and to the south, the American one. The US and the USSR military presence was formally supposed to be temporary in Korea, and that was based on the decisions of the Potsdam Conference, where decided that the two zones of military responsibility had to be merged as soon as possible to form a single and independent state. But the intentions of the United States and Korean reactionary circles were different. Their goal was to control the country, which of course was not easy, since the Korean People's Movement was strong, as we explained, as were the revolutionary forces, and a united Korean state, if it was united, would never lean towards the interests of the domestic reaction or the American imperialism. So it was not an easy task. Thus, despite international agreements and the will of the Korean people who wanted to unite, in August 1948, a puppet regime was established in the southern part of the country, and it called itself the Republic of Korea. And this, of course, forced the reaction, the progressive forces of the Korean people to proceed to a similar type of organization in the north. In September 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded, and it set at its main goal the peaceful unification of the country. It is characteristic that since its establishment, DPRK has constantly proposed the peaceful unification of the country. It does not choose to be separate. It does not choose this isolation. And this will of the people to unite was always clashing with the categorical refusal of the puppet regime. In fact, in June 1950, the month that the war broke out, the request for peaceful unification was made twice, rejected by the reactionary government of South Korea. And the South Koreans, they said that whoever wanted to act in favor of the request for unification should be treated as a traitor. And a few days after this, the guns started doing the talking. USA, of course, still to this day, spreads lies claiming that the war was provoked by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea at the instigation of the international communist movement. The same position that the South Korean regime took. But the truth was completely different. The South Korean regime had much to gain from a US military intervention. And few weeks before the start of the hostilities, they had suffered a decisive defeat in the election. And the regime was shaken by a lack of trust. And when they faced the situation that was steadily deteriorating, they threatened to invade North Korea and declared that they were ready to occupy. They were boasting that they were ready to occupy Pyongyang. Even the most outspoken anti-communist historians that you can find, or writers, could not deny the pro-war nature of the South Korean regime. The historical evidence is just overwhelming. It's just so overwhelmingly against the claim that the Korean War was provoked or even wanted by the Soviet Union. There is no doubt that the Americans wanted this war, and certainly had no hesitation in preparing it in such a way so they can blame their opponents, as they always do, as they still do today. The account of the war that was made by Henry Kissinger does not leave the slightest doubt, and I'm going to quote Henry Kissinger. He writes that within 2 years of the invasion of Korea, America mobilized all its own side beyond the global dividing line. The United States tripled its defense spending and transformed the Atlantic Alliance from a political coalition into one single military organization led by a US commander-in-chief. The rearmament of Germany was already visible, and the first attempts to create a European army had already begun. The gap that existed until then in front of the Soviet troops in Central Europe had begun to be filled. Unquote. This is Kissinger. The imperialist intervention in Korea was carried out with the coverage of the standard coverage of the United Nations. The Americans managed to pass a resolution calling the DPRK an attacker and approving military intervention. All this under the umbrella of the UN. 21 countries took part in the imperialist intervention in Korea, including, I am ashamed to say, my native Greece, because this was indeed a mission of utter shame that, among other things, cost blood to the people of Korea, children, the women, and to those Greek people who participated in the war. They were coming back to Greece in hundreds of coffins. My people who once again paid dearly for the policy of subordination and dependence. You see, the alliances and the interests of the local bourgeoisie cost the lives of working people. And unfortunately, this is still the present, and I'm afraid the future, even today. On July 26, 1953, the Armistice Pact was signed to end the war of the Korean Peninsula after a 3-year war, an atrocious war, the first hot war since the end of World War II and the first hot war of the Cold War. The result had been the dismemberment of the Korean Peninsula, that is, to date, the permanent deployment of the US troops in the region, the intensification of imperialist insults against the DPRK by both the US and the European Union, and especially and very sadly, the division of a people who have always craved to be united again. The people who, after their liberation from Japanese imperialism, wanted to build their own future. The Armistice Pact took place in Geneva in April 1954 with the participation of the Democratic Republic of Korea and the reactionary regime that was established by Americans, and between the USSR, People's Republic of China, the United States, France, England, and representatives from other participating states. This did not provide a solution that benefited the Korean people. The dismemberment of the country was imposed. What are the lessons we can learn from this history? The Americans, in order to perpetuate their own military imperialist presence in the region, used the attack of the South Korean regime for imperialist intervention, as we saw. Today, they also engage in similar behavior. After all, they will not, the US will not give up their anti-communist struggle until we, the people, crush imperialism in our own countries, to write our own history, to send imperialism once and for all, together with capitalism, to where it belongs, to the prehistory of humanity. And the people of the DPRK did exactly that. Their socialist state, their collective spirit, building their country from the rubble, inspires us tremendously. After the massacre of over 30% of their population in the war and constant military and psychological threats, ever since, they have stayed strong. There's a lot to be said about Juche and its roots, in Marxism-Leninism. The people of the DPRK have every reason, they have every historical and rational reason to defend their country and to be actually afraid of Westerners and Western imperialism. We are here tonight saluting their brave fight and their victory. And we must never forget a few things. That US destroyed Korea, North Korea, by bombing and napalming nearly all of North Korea's cities and towns. Over 90% of the buildings. That was coupled with the very real fear of nuclear annihilation that was coming after Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the DPRK never forgot the relentless and the inhumane ferocity of the US Air Force. They never forgot the unspeakable atrocities and rapes of women and children. We must remember that the kind of war that the US military wages is mechanized horror. From the sky, from safe tanks, using allies often as roadkill. It is a coward's war. But the people we celebrate tonight, when we see the women soldiers of the DPRK, when we see the courage of the people dancing in mass dances in the streets of their cities, we must remember the courage and the love of the fatherland that the mainstream media smear as authoritarian. We celebrate the brave people of North Korea, their democratic people's government that does everything to cater and provide for them. And it does that better than any imperialist nation does its own, including during this crisis of the pandemic, where information that was available at the masses in North Korea was extraordinary, clear, accessible, and trusted, and healthcare that was provided one of the best globally, despite the cruelest sanctions imposed on them, same as in Cuba. As I was reading some sources in Greek, I came across an interview that Stalin gave on the Korean War in Pravda in 1951. And I think it's valuable to hear what he had to say. His words resonate today, and I invite you all to listen to them, not only in connection to the Korean War, but in connection to what's happening today. He had predicted, if Britain and the United States reject the peaceful proposals of the People's Government of China, then the war in Korea can only end with the defeat of the invaders. Because this war is completely unpopular between American and British soldiers. Stalin continues in this interview. It is difficult to convince the military that China, which poses no threat to Britain or the United States, is the invader, while the United States, which seized the island of Taiwan and led their troops directly to the Chinese border, is the defensive side. Hence the unpopularity of the war among the Anglo-American soldiers. Stalin continues in this interview. The decision of the United Nations, which considers the People's Republic of China as an invader, is a shameful decision. He continues about the United States. Stalin states, the United Nations, established as a peacekeeping bastion, is becoming an instrument of war, a means of unleashing a new world war. They passed on to the UN the shameful decision on aggression on the People's Republic of China. Stalin continues, in essence, the UN is now not so much a global organization as an organization acting at the behest of the American aggressor. Of course, in the US, England, as well as in France, there are offensive forces wanting a new war. They need the war to gain super profits, to plunder other countries. It is the billionaires and millionaires who see the war as a lucrative fund that makes colossal profits. These offensive forces hold the reactionary governments in their hands and direct them. At the same time, however, they are afraid of their people who do not want a new war and are in favor of maintaining peace. That is why they are trying to use the reactionary governments to confuse their people with lies, to deceive them and present the new war as defensive, while the peaceful policy of the peaceful peoples as aggressive. They try to deceive their people, to impose their aggressive plans on them and to drag them into a new war. Stalin continues in this interview in Pravda, peace will be maintained and consolidated if the people take the case of peacekeeping into their own hands and defend it to the end. War can become inevitable if the instigators of the war manage to confuse the masses with lies, deceive them, and drag them into a new world war. That was in Pravda, February 17th, 1951. As I myself clearly saw through reading about Greece's participation in the Korean War, working class people become perpetrators and victims at the same time, as we are forced to send our children to the slaughters of wars in the name of the imperialist pursuit of enslavement of other peoples and for their gains, the gains of capitalists, creating enemies. On the contrary, as workers, we should be united by our common class interests, the common pursuits that determine our own destinies, as indeed the people of North Korea have done, and therefore join them in a common anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist struggle. We don't want more coffins to return from new theaters of war, but we will defend the right of DPRK and any country to defend its own hard-won sovereignty. Today, the imperialist powers, both the US and the European Union and Japan, are plotting against the DPRK, looking for a reason for a new intervention. Let us not forget the continuous slanders against DPRK, how they call it an evil state, as indeed every state is characterized by imperialists to predetermine it as the next goal. But here is a reality check. The DPRK spends less on weapons than the police department of New York. So we know which is an evil state. The commemoration of the war in Korea sets before every one of us the task of developing our own struggle to dispel every statement that US imperialist media makes against nations that resist monopoly capitalism and domination and expansion of imperialism. We must study the history of nations like Korea, because what our children are taught is a lie. It is a simplification, and we need to explain it to them if we don't want to keep continuing boosting the West's savior complex. Do we really wonder why history is taught like this and why racism becomes systemic with the teaching of history in those racist and orientalist terms? If we grow up thinking that Western democracy is the guardian of peace in the world and everyone else enjoys killing and war, then we are perpetrating this racist cycle. Let us remember that the Korean War was the first of a Cold War that we see re-emerging today. And in it, the United States demonstrated the commitment to contain every effort towards socialism. Let's do the opposite. Let's spread anti-imperialism. Let's defend and take heart from the existence of a contemporary socialist planned economy and its successes in the DPRK. Let us hope for the unification that the Korean people themselves work towards, and let's remind ourselves that peace can only be guaranteed by socialism. Long live the heroes of the Korean fatherland liberation war and their children of today. Long live the Korean people who defended and continue to defend the society that they built against imperialism. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Christina, for a really moving contribution. I'm going to give you a round of applause. I'm sure everyone else is going to join me as well. I am one of the few people that you viewers may have spoken to or met who has been to North Korea, been to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I think Christina highlighted so beautifully the disparity between the historical reality of how Korea has been treated, the incredible injustice done to the people of Korea, of their incredible heroism, the way they stood up to the overwhelming odds they faced and refused to become a victim of history, but rather they were proved that they were their own liberators, that they, through solidarity, through an understanding of the economic order of the imperialist nations that they faced, first Japan and then United States, to their adaptation of a true ideology of liberation, they were able to stand together, unite behind a very strong, newly formed Workers' Party of Korea, form an army, unite their efforts, and through their collective effort, overcome the coalition of the world's most wealthy, but also rapacious and hostile forces. I think it's, one of the strong myths that we always hear is that Korea is a militaristic place. It's just a strangely aggressive and militaristic nation. When you actually, they can only get away with this mischaracterization because there's a total lack of teaching of history, even modern history. There's a total lack of appreciation of where Korea has come from in defending itself. Of course, a nation which has witnessed genocide at the hands of the United States. 4 million people of the Korean population was a massive, perhaps 20% of the population were wiped out by this intervention of United States imperialism. Of course, they needed to defend themselves, and they understood only too well that really, imperialism talks about democracy. Imperialism talks about freedom. It talks about human rights, generally to justify its wars of aggression, but the only thing it really respects is force. And it was the force and resistance put together by the united will of the Korean people, arming themselves as they could, and with the help of the Soviet Union and the heroic contribution also of the Chinese People's Liberation Army volunteers, who sent fully 1 million soldiers. And that's a bond which is sealed in blood. And there's a very strong reason that the Chinese high leadership, high command, military command, political command, understand full well they've fought together on the battlefield in Korea. And of course, the Koreans had a heroic part to play in the national liberation struggle and revolution of China as well. So they're not going to give up their allies lightly. But when you know that history, you realize why that Koreans have to defend their freedom. And why they have to be armed. But despite that alleged militarism, it was a brilliant fact that Christina brought to light that the entire military spending of the north of Korea, much as they don't want to spend it, much as they'd rather spend their economy and economic efforts developing the life of their people, developing the standard of living of their people, developing their industry, developing their agriculture, developing their light industry and heavy industry, developing their entertainment industry, developing their education, their health system. They have to distort their economy by defending themselves, precisely because the United States is constantly waging aggressive so-called military exercises on their doorstep, and they have to defend their freedom. And yet for all that, their military spending is less than that of the United States New York Police Department. The United States, of course, spends $850 billion on the merchandise of death every year, more than enough to solve most of the pressing problems of homelessness, of hunger, of lack of clean water for the whole of humanity, and more than the rest of the world on military spending altogether. The United States has over 1,000 military bases worldwide. So when the United States talks of human rights, freedom, democracy, we must always bear in mind the overwhelming facts of the case and put it in historical perspective. And Krista did that so beautifully. If North Korea sees the reason to develop its nuclear armaments, its satellites technology, its missiles technology, we must always be supportive of their right to do so, to defend their freedom. And I'm deeply hopeful, the Koreans left to themselves will be able to forge once again their unity and independence. There have been several junctures in their modern history where they would have done so were it not for the interference of United States imperialism, who very deliberately stopped sunshine policies, detente policies that would have led there otherwise. So I think we've had a fantastic meeting. I think we've highlighted that it was socialist internationalism, proletarian internationalism that led to that historic defeat of United States imperialism, and we rightly celebrate that, as every free-thinking human being on the face of this planet should celebrate the defeat of any tyrant, because that brings us closer to the freedom of all world peoples. The United States imperialism, together with our own government in the United Kingdom, together with the NATO countries, remains an overwhelmingly aggressive force which prevents liberation of nations and weighs heavily upon the people of the world. This capitalist economic order, right now, as we're entering this COVID pandemic, as we're going through it, is accelerating the process of impoverishment of masses of humanity around the planet, and it is putting an intolerable burden upon working people of all nations. And it's for this reason that we say, quite rightly with Christina, not only do we celebrate this victory of Korea, that Korea is won, but we look for the overthrow of an imperialist system. We look for the overthrow of an imperialist order which can put so much wealth in the hands of so few people, where 7 or 8 people can have as much wealth as more than half of humanity. And it's from this fundamental injustice that all others stem. And these repeated wars of aggression we see again and again and again, and our own government with Dominic Raab meeting Mike Pompeo and talking up the hostility with China, which is not an issue for the normal working people of our country. It's an issue precisely because these countries fear the rise of a multipolar world. They fear the economic independence of any nation. And this is a world system which is an absolute prison house for working people everywhere. And we must work to build a party that's capable of making the British working class put its own rights and interests first. We live in the belly of the beast, but our party is dedicated to building a force that can actually lead to a new, more just world. You know, we're coming through a period where furlough is going to be withdrawn, where there's a global capitalist crisis of economic production, where there's going to be mass unemployment in our country. Probably a quarter of our working age population anyway do not have a job, but they don't count them as unemployed. We may be looking at a situation where as many as half of our working age population do not have employment. It was staggering unemployment we're looking at. And if we're going to carry on and allow this economic exploitation of ourselves, we will never build a better world. So we celebrate this defeat for United States imperialism, but our party is dedicated to building an alternative here at home that will lead to better standard of life for working people here, where we'll truly be able to look other nations in the eye and say that we are true friends of other nations, where we have no ill intent towards them, we have no desire to steal their resources, that we offer our services in peace, that we offer our comradeship to the people of all countries. So I would end by saying, workers of all countries unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains. I would invite all of our listeners to join with us, to subscribe to our mailing list, to have a look. Now, there's a report back from my visit to Korea when I first went there, right at the beginning of our video playlist on our YouTube channel. That's YouTube's Proletarian TV is our YouTube channel. Please go and have a look. There's so many good resources for you to draw upon and learn. Go to our website, thecommunists.org, thecommunists.org. You can sign up. You can express your interest in becoming a supporter and work towards membership. You can draw on many educational resources there. You can find out a lot of the history of the subjects that we discuss here and other places. And we have a tremendous amount, a growing community, a growing party, a growing network of contacts. And we are an active party that will become a force with your help in the life of Britain, building a better, new alternative politics where a democratic form of socialism, where we seek to actually empower the working people and put power in the hands of working people and have an economic change, a real economic change that allows our work to be put at our service of development of ourselves and humanity. So please get in touch reach out to us, join us. You can follow us on Twitter at CPGBML is our Twitter handle. You can follow Christina or myself. My Twitter handle is at Rango, RANGO 1917. And you can find very readily links to Jack, Christina, our fantastic contributions tonight, to Red Youth, to so many resources to expand your knowledge and become a force for good in the world and to help us change Britain for the better. I'm going to close the meeting there and say thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.